Imagine waking up in a world where winter never ends, where rivers freeze until they disappear, and even the strongest creatures collapse under the cold. The Ice Age tore forests from the ground, drained oceans, and buried the world beneath walls of ice taller than skyscrapers. Most species break. Neanderthals disappear. Even saber-toothed cats freeze in their dens. But somehow, against every odd, one fragile band of humans doesn't just endure this apocalypse, they thrive. And in doing so, they become something the world has never seen before. Us. The Earth did not slide into the deep freeze of the Ice Age step by step. It broke. The shift was sudden, like a hidden switch thrown somewhere in the climate system, and in what could pass inside a lifetime, the world changed from livable to lethal. Warm valleys and steady seasons collapsed into pulses of cold that did not let go. Whole regions that once grew forests turned into dry plains. Rivers froze until they vanished. Oceans pulled back like water from a draining tub. What came next was on a scale almost too large to hold in mind. Ice sheets rose taller than mountains. These walls of frozen water pressed down on land with a weight that ground stone to dust. They stretched 2 miles thick and wide enough to bury countries. Places that had felt human footsteps for thousands of years were erased under endless plains of ice. In Europe, trees disappeared first, and then the soil itself followed. Dust storms blew across lands where forests had been, while giant glaciers flattened hills as if they were soft earth. North America was locked under a sheet of white that reached from the Arctic to the plains. Yet this was not a planet covered wall-to-wall in ice. To think of the Ice Age as one endless white film across the globe is to miss the strange truth. It was a patchwork world. Some lands froze hard and dead. Right beside them, other regions bloomed green. The Sahara, which today is dry salt and sand, was filled with lakes. What is now dense Amazon forest opened into grassland. These contrasts formed survival puzzles. An animal or a person could walk from a frozen desert into a zone of grass within the space of a few days, and what worked in one place failed in another. There was no single rule, no single recipe for enduring it. Sea levels were not what we know. They fell by hundreds of feet. What was once ocean floor stood in the sun. The edges of continents stretched far into what we today call the deep sea. Land bridges linked earth masses that had been apart for millions of years. An open plain ran where whales had once swum. The map of the planet tore open, making paths for species to cross back and forth. Winners and losers appeared in strange ways. Some zones became trapped iceboxes, but other strips of land turned green and stayed passable. Bands of reindeer and mammoths marched in wide arcs. Grass grew in corridors where the climate allowed it. To survive meant to keep moving, to track these narrow belts of possibility. Strength alone was not enough. A slow or rigid species fixed in its ways could not keep pace with the changing edges of ice and grass. Adaptability meant life. This was the time when food webs snapped. Big animals that had roamed for long stretches now faced hunger. Herds pressed closer together in tight patches of grazing ground. With less grass came less prey, and when prey weakened, predators too grew thin. Whole ecosystems that had stood stable for ages broke down in spans we would measure in decades. A meadow full of grazing animals could be replaced by barren dirt inside the span of a single human life. In this crisis, Neanderthals were caught in a trap. For hundreds of thousands of years they had lived as masters of the cold. Broad shoulders and heavy bones made them built for the chill. They were skilled hunters and had known success in a Europe rich with game. But when the landscape fragmented, when forests vanished and prey began to scatter, their range shrank. Small pockets of Neanderthals clung to refuges in southern lands. Each refuge was an island of survival shrinking with each turn of the ice. Their strength could not keep them safe when food chains broke piece by piece, and yet another species close kin chose a different path. Other early humans had existed, and one after another they vanished from the record. But Homo sapiens spread. They crossed the new land bridges, they entered grasslands where megafauna fought for resources, and they found ways to endure hunger and storm. The mystery hangs here at the threshold of our story. Why did they survive when almost all others failed? What did they hold that no other human group carried? These ice years created not only hardship but transformation. They did not just test our species, they forced changes deeper than bone and blood. Entirely new ways of being human grew from this cold. We began to use tools not just to fight animals but to fight the climate itself. We started to form communities that lasted longer than a hunt or a migration. We built shelters from pieces of the earth and from bones of giants. We learned to carry fire where there was none, to control heat with skill, and to make clothing that sealed our fragile bodies from the storm. The Ice Age made us curious and cautious in equal measure. It punished mistakes at once, but it also opened paths for those who could test new things, to hunt in new ways, to share beyond one small group, to think across seasons and plan for winters still to come. These were the real survival traits. Nature's puzzle was not one of brute contest. It asked for something else, the capacity to change faster than the world itself shifted. Every other human line fell short. Their tools didn't multiply. Their group stayed small. Their knowledge stayed local. Their voices carried only within the cave walls they lived in. And when their habitats collapsed, they had no wide webs to hold them. The Neanderthal story especially is not just a tale of extinction, but of narrowness. Powerful in one setting, they proved fragile in a shifting patchwork world. We stand here, trying to see through the cold haze of deep time, with a question still glowing. In a planet turned alien, in a moment when survival seemed unlikely for creatures as weak and thin as us, something set Homo sapiens apart. That spark meant we did not just wait for the ice to pass, we spread into it. We walked into the harshest regions and pressed farther still. Now the story turns on that mystery. What did we possess that let us move not just through the corridors of green, but across the frozen expanse itself? What tools, what habits, what shared choices transformed us into the humans who endure to this day? The answer begins when we set two bands side by side. One heavy and strong, designed by nature for cold. The other built light, carrying something invisible yet decisive. Picture a clearing at the edge of a frozen steppe. A herd has just been brought down. Two bands approach the carcass from opposite ends. One group is wide of chest with short, powerful limbs, their bodies packed against the cold. The other looks less imposing, leaner frames wrapped in stitched hides. Both need the meat, yet the difference between them is sharper than what you can see with your eyes. Here lies the paradox. If survival depended only on strength and toughness, those heavy-boned hunters should have thrived. They were built like ice-fitted machines, adapted over hundreds of millennia for wind and frost. They burned fewer calories to stay warm and packed raw muscle that carried them through hand-to-hand hunts with massive prey. By any simple measure, their kind should have held the future. And yet, within only a short stretch of deep time after our first arrival, they were gone. 300,000 years they had stood as the masters of Europe. Then, in less than 10,000 years after we appeared, they faded into silence. It leaves us with an unsettling question. How did the seemingly weaker line, our own, outlast the one nature had refined for so long? The answer comes into focus when you look at how each group hunted. Those broad hunters drove spears into prey at arm's length. Imagine the chaos, men pressing in around a furious bison, stabbing upward at close quarters. The cost was injuries, broken bones, deep cuts, lives ended before their span. Our ancestors, by contrast, threw their weapons. Their shafts flew through the air, tipped with stone points, striking from a safer margin. Later came devices that magnified arm strength many times over, letting a hunter stay well clear of deadly hooves. They even learned to rig traps, dig a pit, line it with sharpened stakes, cover it with brush, and wait. The animal does the work. The hunt could take place while you slept. Now think about life beyond the hunt. Those stocky people gathered in bands of 8, at most a dozen. They shared food within that cell, but the link ended there. If another band wandered near, they often clashed. Our ancestors organised differently. They still lived in small groups, but those groups were tied to others through threads of kinship and gift exchange, stretching across whole landscapes. One family's meat could travel hundreds of kilometres. Stone from far-off quarries turned up where no quarry existed. Marriage and trade kept them linked like a vast net stretched over the continent. The cold did not isolate them, it connected them. This woven network mattered because conditions were never stable. Storms shifted, herds moved, rivers froze. One camp might starve in a lean season, but another could share what they had, knowing one day they might need the same. The strong bodies of their rivals guarded their own, yet our line built a safety net that reached far beyond the fire's glow. There is another key. Look at the pace of change in tools. Those broad hunters used the same stone shapes for tens of millennia. They worked, but they did not change much. Meanwhile, our kind reshaped stone into blade after blade. Scrapers for hides, awls for smoothing, points for different animals, wide for soft flesh, narrow for thick hide. More than 60 types in just a fraction of the time. A toolkit was no longer a simple object. It was a system, evolving with each season. And with tools came symbols. Deep in caves, images of animals cross the stone walls. They may seem like art, but they work to something closer to a shared memory system. A reindeer etched here might match herds known seasonally hundreds of kilometres away. These painted walls, lit by flicker of fat lamps, became meeting points between groups separated by valleys of ice. The stocky hunters left almost nothing of this kind. They became trapped in shrinking valleys of survival. We carried maps and warnings in pigment, visible even to strangers walking in centuries later. You can watch the difference in how they treated food. In their camps, a kill was butchered and eaten much as it came. In ours, bones show cut marks that suggest measured division, portions calculated so even the weakest ate first. No wasted energy, no random sharing, but a method that spread risk. It was cooperation not just in words, but in mathematics played out on carcasses. Leadership also moved differently. In a small group of 10, the loudest or the strongest could direct the hunt. But in a network connected across lands, you needed other rules. Guidance shifted with skill and need. The tracker might lead one day, the elder another, the toolmaker the next. It made decision-making flexible, adjusting to the moment instead of fixed on one figure. When you combine these differences, a picture emerges. The rival hunters had huge advantages written into their bones, yet they relied on fixed strategies. When the climate turned, they met each shift with the same set of answers. Our ancestors lacked their physical build but carried an advantage in thought. They adapted quickly, sometimes between seasons. They thought in networks, not isolates. They summed power not in muscle, but in connection. And the evidence is stark. Their numbers waned. Camps grew small and desperate. Our numbers spread from valley to valley, from continent to continent. It was not brawn that decided the outcome. It was the mind shaping new tools, the bonds linking one group's fire circle to another's horizon, the willingness to adapt faster than ice could trap them. So when we ask why they vanished, it is not a mystery of physical contest. It is a story of pace, of innovation, of shared memory. They stood with the strength of giants, yet what mattered was being nimble. being able to leap between ideas, to swap knowledge across distances measured not just in miles, but in generations. That is the transformation worth seeing. The cold did not fall equally on every face. It forced a new kind of humanity to rise, one where survival was measured not in strength, but in connection and thought. And the proof is in the silence of their camps, weighed against the spread of ours. Because from this moment survival shifted. It no longer meant simply withstanding the freeze. It meant reshaping the very instruments of life, clothing, fire, shelter, into something new. All of which would soon take form with tools that look unimpressive at first glance, but in their quiet way, change the reach of our species. A mother sits by the glow of embers, her fingers moving with care. In her hands is a needle carved from bone, no bigger than the span of her thumb. A thread of sinew runs through its eye. The motion is quiet, almost ordinary, but in that simple act you can glimpse how humans broke free from the limits of the body. What looks like a craft project is, in truth, a tool that would change the map of survival. Imagine what it meant to face wind that froze the breath in your lungs. Before the needle existed, hides were thrown over the shoulders like blankets. They worked when the air was merely cold. But when the night sank to 40 below and the wind pushed through every opening, those loose wraps became traps of ice. Heat poured out, and death crept in through the smallest gap. No amount of brute strength could fight the wind clawing through one's clothes. People needed a way to turn skin into armour, and so a new idea was born. Someone, somewhere, took a length of bone and carved the first tiny hole through its end. It was the beginning of precision engineering. That opening turned rough hide into fitted clothing. Seams could now be pulled tight, joints sealed against water, and layers stacked into traps for warm air. It was not the thickness of fur that saved them, but the shape cut and sewn by these needles. For the first time, clothing moved with the body instead of against it. Picture a circle of relatives stitching by firelight. Mothers, sisters, and grandmothers sat with hides laid flat, cutting strips to shape, sewing sleeves that locked at the wrist, and collars that hugged the throat against icy air. They created parkas with layers thick enough to insulate yet flexible enough for a hunter to bend and run. Each stitch meant one less path for wind to slip in. Clothing shifted from a loose wrap to a system, much like walls and doors make a house. Archaeological finds show how far this went. In the dirt of Denisova Cave, tiny bone needles still lie buried after tens of thousands of years. Some rest with their eyes intact, proof of use at a scale more delicate than making tools from stone. In another site, a man was buried in clothing covered with ivory beads. The patterns of those beads trace out seams, cuffs, and hems, revealing garments that took painstaking time to craft. To decorate meant the clothes were not just practical, they became carriers of identity and care. Clothing had turned into both shield and symbol. With this new tool, human feet pressed northward into ground too harsh for any other species. The needle was more than a point of bone. It was the key to crossing the line of the 45th parallel, where winters tested the limits of blood and breath. Beyond that boundary lay landscapes of endless frost that no simple hide could endure. The sewing needle turned those wastelands into places where families could walk, hunt, and raise children. Geography itself bent to a tool small enough to slip behind the ear. And yet the revolution stayed hidden for centuries in the shadow of hunts. The image of men spearing mammoths dominates the picture of Ice Age life. But when we look closer, it was the quiet labour around the hearth that unlocked the Arctic. Without fitted clothing, no mammoth hunt could even begin. The seamstresses who stitched in silence carried more weight in the survival of our species than tusked giants ever did. The work itself was complex. These were not crude lashings or hurried threads. Water needed to stay out, so seams were overlapped and stitched in ways that shed rain and melt water. Insulation was built in layers, trapping air just as feathers keep a bird warm. Skins were cut and joined so that joints stretched without tearing. We would call it engineering, though the skills came from practice passed hand to hand. Their designs rival some of the cold weather gear we use even now. Think of what this means in the language of deep time. Before the needle, humans were bound by the warmth of a fire or the shelter of a cave. Once needle and thread came together, warmth could be carried on the body itself. It was as if humans learned to build tiny climates they could wear, sealed against wind, rain and frost. In that sense, they became the first creators of portable weather. They carried summer stitched into skin. The discovery of old needles tells us something else. People were not racing against hunger every moment of their lives. Time was carved out for long, careful work. Beads sewn into hems were not needed for warmth. They were signs of patience, of planning for seasons ahead, and of clothes made not only to shield the body but to honour the person inside them. These were acts of memory and love sewn into each piece. Layer by layer, humans built a second skin. It turned whole continents into possible homes. Animals evolved fur or fat to meet the cold. Our ancestors went another way. They invented a technology flexible enough to copy the fur of the bear, the feathers of the bird, even the waterproof skin of a seal, all depending on what hunt or harvest allowed. That flexibility gave humans a reach no other species could match. The needle marks the point where we see humans no longer limited to biology. From that moment, survival became less about the body one was born with and more about what the hands could make. It wasn't just adaptation in the genetic sense, it was adaptation by invention. With each seam sewn tight against the cold, humanity stepped further into a new role. Tools no longer only cut meat or shaped stone, now they shaped life itself. And from here, the story grows larger. Clothes were only one half of the shield. Soon, entire shelters would rise from the bones of giants, offering walls, roofs, and hearths where winter could not reach. The stitching of hides by firelight was just the start of a far greater engineering leap waiting on the open steppe. Across the windswept steppe of Ukraine, a strange circle of shadows lies on the ground. At first it looks like scattered boulders, but each curve and ridge is bone. Mammoth bone, skulls the size of barrels, femurs heavy enough to break wagons, tusks longer than a person is tall. They form rings so wide they could hold 20 people, rising in foundations that weigh over 20 tons. Too precise to be random, too heavy to be moved by hunters drifting from kill to kill. Something deliberate was built here, something that speaks of permanence. Imagine the problem these people faced. In much of the Ice Age world, trees were gone. Forest retreated south. The land stripped bare by glaciers offered no wood for huts, no beams for roofs. Even brush became scarce. To endure those winters, a group needed more than cloaks and courage. They needed walls thick enough to cut the wind, roofs strong enough to hold snowdrifts, and a way to keep heat close. The steppe offered only one material in abundance: the bones of giants. Mammoths were everywhere on that land, grazing herds that shaped the grassland itself. When they died, their remains lingered in the frozen soil for years. People gathered these bones not as trophies but as building blocks. Skulls gave a wide, heavy base that sat stabilizing on the ground. Shoulder blades, flat like shields, made the walls. Ribs and femurs, long and strong, were bent with practiced heat into rafters that stretched overhead like the ribs of a great ship. Each bone was chosen for its shape and strength, no part wasted or ignored. At Mazirek, you can still see this planning in place. The jaws of mammoths interlocked, fitted together like puzzle pieces, locking out the wind. Ribs were set into gaps, overlapping, creating nearly seamless seals to block rain and snow. Tusks were pushed deep into the earth. then warmed with controlled fire so they could bend just enough to form arches. The builders weren't stacking random piles of carcass. They were engineers mastering a new medium of scale and density. The cold forced careful thought, and here, thought left behind walls that still speak. These bone houses changed what survival meant. In the tundra outside, temperatures fell without mercy. Inside, careful insulation kept rooms at a steady warmth. The dense bone, filled with air pockets and marrow chambers, trapped dead air much like modern insulation. Add hide stretched over the framework and the difference became staggering. A bone house could hold heat 40 degrees warmer than the wind outside. Inside, children could sleep, tools could be shaped, food could be cooked and stored. Each dwelling turned the killing climate into a livable space. The idea of permanence is what strikes most sharply. These were not camps of a few days. At sites like Kostenki, layers of rebuilding show that families returned again and again. The same circles were mended, repaired, and expanded. Over time, they became places passed from one generation to the next. Inherited homes, inherited knowledge of how each bone fit, how each arch would bear weight, how to align openings against or with the wind. Villages grew not from chance gatherings, but from planned, multi-generational lives tethered to chosen ground. The psychology runs deeper still. For hunters, nothing towered larger in fear and reverence than the mammoth. It dwarfed men, a fortress of fur and horn, and here, those very forms that once brought terror surrounded families as walls and roofs, transformed from enemy to ally. To live inside mammoth bones was to turn danger into protection, to take the force of nature that threatened survival and remake it into the very structure of home. In that act lay something beyond practical skill. It was a statement of dominance, or perhaps of balance, a sign that humans could reframe even the largest animal into a partner in shelter. This stands in sharp contrast to the popular image of cave dwellers. It is easy to picture humans huddled in damp caves, fighting for warmth around meagre flames. Yet bone houses tell a different story. These people did not hide in nature's cracks. They raised their own architecture. To build such dwellings meant planning teams to gather huge bones, skill passed hand to heat and shape tusks, an agreement within the group to maintain work beyond the shift of seasons. Cavemen is a phrase that dissolves at the sight of such houses. We are looking instead at master builders. Think of the knowledge these bone engineers carried. Which bone held weight without splintering? How far a shoulder blade could span before it cracked? How to align tusks into arcs that could carry snow? This was construction science, tested not in textbooks but in wind and time. If a wall failed, lives were lost. If a structure held, generations could thrive. Over centuries, this silent understanding flowed through families like heirloom recipes, each hut a library of memory and skill. Inside, these homes shaped society. With warmth held in and day length extended by firelight, tasks stretched into the long winter. People could gather in numbers larger than a single family. They could plan hunts, pass on stories, and shape tools far from danger. Community gathered not just around a fire pit, but within a building able to stand against the full weight of an Ice Age storm. Shelter became more than cover. It became a vessel for culture itself. Look again at the circles of giant bone lying on the steppe. What we see is not debris. It is urban design in deep time, built from what the land offered. The circles mark villages, complete with spaces for hearths, storage pits, and work areas. The webs of bone show how survival crossed from individual instinct into collective planning. Each structure demanded coordinated labour, many arms, many backs, minds tuned to one purpose. The contrast is sharp. Neanderthals in scattered caves, waiting on seasons they could not master, and humans here, carving homes on treeless steppe with the remnants of the most massive creatures. One image bound to limits, the other stepping past, remaking the land with the largest bodies nature had provided. That difference wasn't just comfort, it was a key to spreading into places no other human species had endured. By building lasting homes of bone, humans created roots where nothing else could grow. It reframed the idea of settlement itself. No soil to sow, no beams to cut, but still architecture rose. Shelter mastery joined with tailored clothing, weaving together twin shields against the cold. Homes of bone, coats of hide. Together they built a survival system portable enough to spread across continents, yet deep and strong enough to make real villages rise on the tundra. And from this union of skill and community the path opened. With walls to hold warmth and clothes to trap it against the skin, bands of our kind could march into the bleakest expanse and know they would endure. These Ice Age homes are not curiosities scattered on the plains. They are monuments to commitment, whispers of architecture that turned predators into pillars and extinction into expansion. Each ring of mammoth bone marks the moment when humans stopped merely avoiding the cold and instead began shaping whole climates of their own making. This brings us forward in the story, for firelight, clothing and bone walls built on one foundation. Yet the next step reached even deeper. When wood grew scarce and winters pressed even harder, people called on another resource, one hidden in the body of animals themselves. They mastered fire in ways that would stretch science forward long before metal or glass existed. The balance sheet of Ice Age survival was cruel. Forests thinned to nothing. Wood, once taken for granted, became as rare as a gemstone. And yet, across this frozen stage, fires still shine bright in the archaeological record. So how did bands of people keep flame alive when the very fuel it fed on was gone? The answer begins with bone. At first glance, a femur seems nothing more than hard and dense material, but inside lies marrow and fat. When treated with heat and air, these parts release energy that burns hotter and longer than most wood left on the tundra. Even ribs soaked with fat became fuel. What was once the remnant of a kill turned into a lifeline. The act is both grim and ingenious. Death recast as warmth. And it was not a simple toss of bones into flame. People learned which pieces worked best, how to break and lay them so oxygen reached the right places, and how to coax steady burn from what looked unburnable. Fires lit on bone could reach temperatures high enough to shape tools or cook dense meals. This was not brute burning, it was controlled combustion, handled with the same care as stitching a parka. Now picture the darkness of a glacial winter. Nights stretched for months in some latitudes, beyond what a torch could handle. Here, we meet the quiet glow of stone lamps. A hollowed stone filled with animal fat and a wick of moss or fibre gave light not for minutes or hours, but for days. While a modern candle sputters and shrinks, these lamps kept steady flame. Their light made it possible to sew, to carve, to plan. They pushed back not just the dark, but the isolation that dark breeds. The Arctic night became bearable because people could take light with them. Their understanding of fire extended beyond keeping warm or seeing. Flint itself was treated with heat. In its raw form, flint can be brittle, fracturing in uneven ways. But heated carefully to exact ranges, the stone transforms. Hard edges become sharper. Flakes come off in predictable lines. This technique belongs not to metallurgy, which came much later, but the principle is the same. Use precise heat to change the behaviour of materials. It is evidence of an early form of chemistry. In a world where mistakes could cost survival, people learned the temperatures that sharpen their future. Cooking too took on refinement. When firewood could not be spent on open flames, hot stones became the answer. Heated in a bone-powered hearth, then dropped into water held in a hide-lined pit, The stones turned into invisible fires beneath the surface. Food simmered without wasting resources, and smoke didn't reveal a camp to predators. This method squeezed the most calories from meagre supplies while keeping danger at bay. Each choice, from lamp to stone boil, was an efficiency calculation. Fire was not just comfort, it was a rationed tool, used with as much precision as any spear. But to focus only on the physics misses another half of the story. Hearths weren't scattered at random. People gathered around single communal fires where heat and light drew them together. Archaeological layers show these hearths carefully placed, sometimes with channels where fresh air pulled smoke upward. The flames warmed groups, not loners. In their glow, stories were told, songs repeated, skills explained to children. We might call them the first classrooms. Here, oral memory passed vital information through generations. Fire acted as glue, fusing groups and creating collective intelligence greater than any single hunter's skill. There is evidence that these hearths were engineered with care for more than smoke. Some families used ceramic stones or thick slabs placed in the fire until red hot. Pulled out and buried under hides, they released warmth long after flames had died. In effect, they stored the day's fire, letting families sleep in heat hours later. Such thermal engineering speaks to a level of planning beyond survival. It was steady mastery of the environment, a way to manage comfort rather than scramble against it. Even the size of hearths mattered. Too large wasted fuel. Too small failed to hold steady heat. Sites show hearths kept in a narrow range that controlled airflow, distributing smoke and warmth evenly through shelters. Without knowledge of airflow diagrams or scientific models, people still found the sweet spots where heat lasted longest and smoke dispersed. The arrangement of stones and vents shows careful testing, passed between hands rather than books. Fire was science built through repetition across deep time, and with every advance came transformation in the way groups lived. The bonfires showed that nothing went to waste. The lamps extended daily life into nights that would otherwise choke out activity. Heated flint gave sharper blades to feed more mouths. Hot stone cooking stretched fuel and food in equal measure. Hearths turned survival camps into social hubs. Fire shaped not only the body but also the mind. Around its light, people thought together. They made plans, rituals, even art. Fire gave them the hours. They filled those hours with culture. So when we look back at Ice Age fire technology, it is more than survival sparks. It is a demonstration of adaptation on multiple levels: fuel, light, material, meals, and community. Each choice layered on another until flames became infrastructure. In deep time perspective, fire blurred from a flicker of light into an entire system of knowledge. And yet there was more waiting in this skill set. Fire did not only cook and warm. The knowledge of controlled heat would soon be pointed outward, toward new weapons. The same understanding of fuel and combustion that made bone burn bright would etch stone into deadly precision, giving hunters the tools to meet giants that had ruled the Ice Age for millions of years. The picture most of us carry of Ice Age hunting starts with a human running into the path of a giant mammoth, spear raised high, throwing it with brute force at the beast's chest. But if we pause, the physics does not hold. No human arm could drive a wooden spear deep enough or hard enough to pierce the chest of an animal with hide thicker than a modern elephant. The image is wrong. What actually happened was quieter, slower, and far more clever. The earliest hunters began with heavy wooden spears. These could work against smaller prey if used at close range, but that range was deadly when the target weighed several tons. Getting too close meant being crushed under tusks or feet. A new trick appeared, a simple stick with a hooked end. That was the atlatl, or spear thrower. It acted as a lever, adding extra reach to the human arm. With that extension, A hunter could hurl a spear many times harder and faster than bare muscle allowed. What once was a hand-thrown stick became a true projectile. The spear thrower gave distance, and with distance came safety. A group could stand back from the chaos of a charging animal and still drive points deep enough to bring it down. The atlatl was one of those inventions that looked almost too plain to matter, yet it turned the body into a machine, changing the math of survival. When measured, some of those spears left the thrower at speeds few human arms could hope to reach alone. Later came another leap, the bull. But it was not the crude bent branch shown in simple drawings. People carved it from layered horn, sinew, and chosen wood. The bowstring tight with twisted gut or sinew, stored power like a spring. When released, the stored energy snapped forward in the arrow, carrying it faster and with more force than the longest atlatl. With this came range and precision. Prey could be struck from far off, and with practice, struck again before it even knew the first wound had opened. That changed hunting from risk to system. But the creative edge did not stop at throwing tools. Across Ice Age sites lie long, narrow points shaped with care. Some belonged not to thrown spears but to great pikes. Imagine a wall of sharpened stakes hidden in snow, angled just right, tipped with the famous Clovis points. When a mammoth or bison charged, its own weight carried it forward. The animal's momentum did the killing. The hunters had built a trap where the prey destroyed itself on the weapon. It was the physics of leverage turned inside out. The power came not from the human arm but from the animal's own mass. Step back and you start to see a pattern. Each prey demanded its own tool. Reindeer, with hides not too thick but full of flowing blood, were best taken with wide blades that cut channels for loss. Mammoths required narrow spear points, made to slip through rib gaps and drive into deeper organs. Fish needed barbed tips to hold them from slipping. Birds were brought down with blunt points that hit strong without tearing meat apart. Hunters were not generalists swinging one tool at all. They tuned their points to each target like a craftsman fitting parts. Even the seasons changed the weapon choice. In the cold of winter, when hides grew thick, points were sharpened to fine edges. In warmer months, lighter tools worked well on thinner skin. Microscopic study of surviving blades shows the dedication to this cycle. Edges shaped different for cold and warm, hides thick or thin. Imagine the planning behind it. Workshops must have stacked with different runs of blades, sorted by time of year so that when the season turned the weapons could change with it. The genius here lay not in stronger muscles but in clever use of force. Prey carried mass that dwarfed the hunters. Instead of trying to match it, humans flipped the balance. They used the animal's own push, its own momentum against it. Atlatls multiplied distance. Bows stored energy beyond bare arms. Traps positioned points where the prey's rush would do the rest. In these methods, leverage, speed, and impact became the hunter's allies. It was the same physics that later built engines, but centuries earlier applied to hide and horn. The hunt was more than tools of wood and stone. It reached into the mind. Archaeologists have uncovered masks shaped from skulls of animals, worn as covers for the human head. A hunter inside could step closer before a herd sensed wrongness. Some bands made noisemakers, crude rattles and whistles, driving herds in chosen directions or startling them into narrow passes. Others watched herds for months, learning migration paths as regular as the stars. This was not luck but study. People read behaviour, then bent it. And then came persistence hunts. Humans did not need to run fastest. They needed to last longest. Prey like antelope could sprint strong, but soon their bodies overheated. Humans, stripped of heavy hair and sweating through skin, could keep pace for hours. In relays, hunters chased until beasts stumbled, too tired to rise. When endurance ran its course, a single jab finished what hours of pursuit had prepared. Each step was part of a system of energy and patience. Every layer of these tactics made life safer. A single hunter no longer had to gamble body and bone against tusks twice his height. Groups planned hunts months ahead, armed with tools made for a single task, applied at exactly the right season. Games of chance became managed harvests. By the time bones were stripped for knives or clothing, the band had already cut down the uncertainty of the hunt itself. What looks brutal at first sight, giants brought down by stone and wood, was actually precision. Each new step of weaponry multiplied the odds of success with less danger to the hunter. From lever arms to stored energy, from sharp to blunt, each shift was an answer to the same riddle: how to draw more from the world with less risk of loss. The result was a shift in the very balance of survival. Humans, once simply another prey species, began to tip the numbers. Instead of losing hunters in every chase, more came home fed. Instead of chance recollection, knowledge was written into points and notches, sharpness and shape. The survival margin stretched farther with each innovation. Imagine now the tundra as a quiet workshop. It is not the chaos of spears against charging giants, but the careful work of cutting flint to a needed edge, tying sinew at just the right tension, carving wood so that arc and string align. It is the sound of planning before action. The Ice Age became a season of factories without smoke. Production scaled to the needs of a family, an extended band, and sometimes trade beyond sight. Because of this, the idea of conquest changes. Humans did not conquer the Ice Age with brute push. They learned to use the deep rules of physics, of leverage and fatigue, of camouflage and habit. They pressed animal behaviour into tools, just as they pressed stone into points. The tools were weapons, but more than that, they were lessons in how to think as the world itself thinks. This is how survival broadened. Clothing kept out cold, bone homes kept in heat, fire stretched the day into night, weapons turned prey's strength against itself. Put together, the package meant humans could now span an entire hemisphere, no longer bound to single valleys. When all was combined, it was a new form of life. Groups who crafted, planned and survived by turning mind to matter. Each sharp edge was not only stone but proof of a different way to live. And so, layer by layer, the hunt became transformation. From spears too heavy to throw, to lever arms and bowstrings, to traps where the prey's own step did the killing. Each invention was a page, part of a longer story. That story was not of shock or strength, but of steady answers to steady problems. Out of it rose not just survival, but expansion. It was this union of weaponry, shelter and fire that built the complete survival kit. One strong enough to push humans across the frozen map of Earth. A hand lifts a piece of flint, dark and glassy. The blows that follow are not random strikes. Each tap is aimed, rhythm held steady, angles chosen with care. Shards peel off like thin leaves, one after another. From a single stone core, dozens of razor edges appear. This is not guessing in the dark. It is controlled work, each fracture planned in advance. Think of what that means for survival. Earlier humans used one stone for one task. You chipped an edge, cut until it dulled, then started over. Here, the logic changed. Instead of making one simple knife, people shaped cores designed to break in repeatable ways. From a block of rock, they stripped off an entire set of matching blades. The change multiplied efficiency. Suddenly a single stone became a stockpile. One hunter could walk away with cutting edges enough for a group. At some sites, the ground still tells the story. Layers of broken flakes spread across cave floors in clear order. In what is now France and Spain, the layout of these workshops shows something remarkable. Instead of scattered strikes, there are zones. one place for shaping cores, another for prying off blades, another for sharpening or trimming points. It looks like an early form of an assembly line. Toolmaking was no longer the quick act of one pair of hands. It had become an organised effort involving many people, each repeating a step. The sequence is as much physics as craft. Flint, struck at a sharp angle, behaves like frozen glass. The fracture runs in a predictable curve. Skilled workers found that curve again and again, producing blades longer than a hand, just a few millimetres thick, sharp enough to slice meat cleanly. The efficiency was astonishing. A lump of stone the size of a fist could outfit a hunting party, with the tools they needed for the season. Now the wooden handle entered the story. You no longer had to hold a single stone in your palm until it wore down. Wood was cut and shaped with grooves where blades could be fixed with sinew and resin. It gave the tool a sturdy shaft, a lever to multiply force, and when the edge snapped or dulled, you didn't need a whole new knife. You slid one insert out, pressed another in, and the handle lived on. Broken tools turned into quick repairs. The key part of the tool was no longer disposable. Hunters carried these shafts with them as we might carry a multi-tool today. One moment the slot held a fine blade for butchering. Another time it bore a broader edge for scraping hides. Later, the same handle might hold a barbed point for fishing. In the space of a few breaths, one person could swap tasks without carrying a sack of different tools. This was modular design, millennia before the word existed. Some evidence shows blades of the same shape spread across regions far apart. When identical points surface hundreds of miles from their original stone source, it hints at something larger. Not every group made every tool. Some bands became specialists, producing sets in great numbers. These were traded, carried, and passed on along routes that stretched across continents. The ground record shows a flow of skill and stone beyond what single families could have achieved. Trade was not only goods but knowledge. A blade was more than utility. Certain pieces were so thin that light passed through them. Some were carefully heat-treated, edges too fine for daily work. They were showpieces, symbols you could hold in your hand. Such tools may have carried meaning like money or a passport. When one band met another, the quality of a gift told a silent story about skill, identity, and reputation. Tools were currency and message woven together. The adaptability had huge effects in life and death moments. Imagine a party out on the steppe far from a camp. If a spear point shattered during a hunt, the hunter reached into a pouch, swapped in a new point, and returned to the chase. No need to stop the hunt or return home. Speedy replacement was not a small convenience. It lifted the odds of survival during scarce times when a failed strike might mean starvation. What emerges from these sites is a picture not of desperate survival, but of systematic planning. Stone was treated almost like raw stock in a factory. Out of one block came uniform parts. They were carried, traded, replaced, and innovated. Knowledge moved along with the blades themselves, spreading techniques faster than any one group could invent alone. The toolkit hints at an early economic system, division of skill, production, and distribution. Think of it like reading the layers of a riverbank. The silt tells you floods came in rhythm. The stones tell you how fast the water once ran. In the same way, tool debris left on cave floors tells us human minds were shifting into new gear. This was no longer simple adaptation to local prey. It was invention setting its own pace, planning far ahead of the hunt. The Stone Age toolkit was not just sharper edges, it was a change in how survival itself was organised. It meant humans had portable factories in their hands, each core a seed for many lives' worth of tools. Repair replaced disposal, sharing replaced isolation, and design replaced accident. These were the quiet revolutions under the skin of daily life. That is why this tool system matters. From the strike of flint against stone came more than a blade. It was the opening of a path where knowledge spread wider than family lines, where survival rested not only on strength, but on foresight and exchange. These tools laid the groundwork for innovations still to come. From them, the line runs straight into the next forms of human survival that carried us beyond the Ice Age and into the world that followed. When most people imagine Ice Age survival, their minds go first to the hunt for mammoths, those rare and dangerous battles with giants. But the quieter truth rests in another animal, one far smaller. Reindeer, moving with clockwork precision, carried a different promise. They were not spectacular, they were dependable, and in a frozen world where chance could mean death, dependable mattered more than glory. Mammoths roamed in great herds, and when a group of hunters succeeded, the reward could feed many mouths. But success against such prey came rarely. The weight of chance hung over every mammoth hunt, and failure meant weeks of hunger. Reindeer were less dramatic, but brought something mammoths never could: routine. Their migrations followed strict paths, year after year, passing through valleys and ridges like rivers flowing in rhythm. That rhythm gave humans a new kind of certainty, the closest thing to a calendar in a landscape where the seasons punished mistakes. Picture herds moving through the same pass each autumn, hunters already waiting, not wandering. Camps built in advance on the very ground where footsteps would fall again the next year. It was not guesswork, it was science of repetition, a reading of animal time as precise as tides. The bones left behind at kill sites show the pattern clearly. Layer upon layer, stacked neat like pages in a book, each level belonging to another year's planned harvest. These were not scattered kills taken by chance encounters. These were scheduled events, centuries of people returning to the same spot with the same knowledge in mind. The story deepens when we look at what happened after the hunt. For a mammoth, much of the bulk spoiled before it could be eaten. For reindeer, each part found a use. Meat filled bellies in winter, hides became clothing of unmatched warmth. Sinews stretched into threads and bowstrings, antlers shaped into points or handles. Even the stomachs offered contents used as healing medicine. Nothing was wasted. In a world short on resources, reindeer were entire toolkits wrapped in fur. They gave hunters not only dinner, but also the daily gear of survival. This total use of the animal turned human groups into specialists. Just as later farmers tied themselves to the planting cycle of wheat or rice, these Ice Age people tied their lives to the migration clock of reindeer. They timed travel to match the herds. They built their world around the moving pulse of animals they followed more closely than rivers. They became, in a sense, reindeer people. Now compare them to other bands scattered across the steppe. Some chased elk, ox, or horse across erratic ranges, gambling on luck over distance. Those groups spent much of their time in motion, always uncertain where tomorrow's food might be. Reindeer specialists could stand still, confident that dinner would walk into the valley on schedule. That kind of reliability turned hunger into planning. Families no longer had to live from crisis to crisis. They could think ahead. Planning had ripple effects. Larger groups could form because food was steady. Instead of a tight circle of a dozen, a camp might swell with 20 or 30, extended families sharing the same migration road. And with a margin of abundance, not every hand had to hunt. Some hands stayed at camp to shape tools, carve beads, stitch hides, or pass on songs. Arts and crafts became possible only when bellies stayed full. Reindeer migration offered that window. In this way, the hunt for reindeer began to resemble the first experiments in resource management. Each valley taken in season, each herd approached with timing that ensured numbers lasted. Too much pressure would have meant collapse. But the repeating returns show restraint built into the system. Like farmers counting seeds, hunters measured herds, harvesting without breaking the cycle. For the first time, human survival linked not only to luck and skill, but to balance. It was a fragile balance, yet one that carried entire communities forward for generations. The archaeological record carries the traces. In certain valleys, the bones lie in ordered masses, evidence of drives where whole herds were funneled into traps or ravines. Hunters worked together, using noise, fire, or fences of wood to steer the flow, knowing the same passage would be used again the next year. It was not chaos, it was coordinated, and those who mastered it gained not just survival for the season, but a foothold in the coldest climates on Earth. Think for a moment of the shift this represents. Earlier, life was led on the edge. Find food today or die tomorrow. With reindeer, the clock stretched further. People could look at the valley floor and say, next month they will be here. That mental step, predicting, expecting, planning, moved humanity closer to the mindset of farming long before seeds were planted in soil. The herds were not owned, but they were counted. Not crops, but still harvests of a kind. This rhythm shaped identity. Villages became known by their relation to the herds. Children grew into hunters, already knowing the paths trodden by ancestors. Knowledge was not about chance, but about prediction, about remembering which valley filled with snow too late or which river froze too early. To track animals in this way was to read the landscape like a book with repeating lines. Survival meant learning how to read those lines correctly and pass them to the next generation. The advantage stretched even further. With steady food, trade became possible. A group sure of their next hunt could offer hides or antlers to neighbours, receiving in return stone from far quarries or beads for adornment. Stability gave room for exchange. That exchange tied communities together across distance, making migration roads not just paths for animals, but social roads for people. When we step back, the mathematics become clear. For every unpredictable mammoth kill, there were dozens of reindeer walked into the hands of waiting hunters. One giant might fall and rot, but hundreds of smaller bodies filled racks of drying meat, stretched hides and stocked camps with supplies. It was not grandeur, it was arithmetic, and arithmetic, carried out again and again, gave safety in a frozen world. So the real story of Ice Age survival is not the rare heroism of the giant kill, but the quiet patience of those who learned to follow the migrations. Year after year, generation after generation, the reindeer returned, and with them came meals, clothes, thread, tools, and medicine. The certainty of their steps turned chaos into pattern. And as great as this survival system was, it did not stand alone. The bodies of reindeer filled mouths and warmed skin, but the land held another secret. Plants too offered more than calories. Some carried compounds that could change thought itself, shifting the growth and power of the human brain. From following the herds, the path would soon bend toward roots and seeds, where another chapter of adaptation was already taking shape. One of the quietest discoveries about Ice Age life came from teeth. Trapped in plaque that had hardened for thousands of years were tiny plant grains. In those fragments were barley, oats, even herbs that healed illness. They show us that the picture of humans living only on meat from great hunts was never the whole truth. The mouths of our ancestors tell a different story. For a long time, the Ice Age was painted as a blood-soaked struggle. Film and books gave us images of men forever chasing mammoths, or cornering woolly rhinoceros. That view seemed natural. Hunting left dramatic bones behind while roots and grains vanished. But when we pull apart the evidence, the balance tilts. Plants, harder to trace, may have been the steady fuel of survival. Archaeologists find grinding stones the size of a child, worn into smooth hollows. Too heavy to carry on each journey, they were left in caves and camps. Their weight tells us that people returned to the same spots to work plant food on a scale that looked permanent. These stones ground down roots and seeds into flour long before farming fields was even imagined. The marks still etched in their faces are the imprints of hand after hand using them in rhythm. The energy gained from plants mattered. Seeds and roots gave carbohydrates, which break down quickly in the body. For hunters who walked miles and carried heavy loads, this was quick power. And for brains burning far more calories than any other organ, glucose from starch became essential. In a sense, plants powered the very thinking that allowed humans to plan, imagine, and adapt during freezing ages. Roots and seeds were not just eaten raw. Fire softened fibres and broke barriers. A tuber baked in embers gave nutrients that would otherwise pass through the body unused. Grinding and cooking, paired together, expanded what the human stomach could gain. For kids, who needed steady fuel even when hunts failed, plant meals helped them grow without waiting for the next carcass. This was a shift from fragile dependence to a more stable base. Plants were also a medicine chest. Chamomile eased stomach pain. Yarrow slowed bleeding. Willow bark cooled fever. These have bitter tastes and low food value, yet they appear in the dental record. That means people went out of their way to consume them for reasons other than hunger. Knowledge of such uses has to be spoken and remembered. Someone pointed to a flower and told its story. That memory kept groups alive when wounds festered or fevers spread. Oral tradition was not leisure, it was pharmacy. Think of the risk calculations in that world. A mammoth hunt could feed many mouths, but might also fail or leave hunters dead. A root harvest demanded less danger, yet yielded predictable amounts of food. One good day of digging plants could anchor weeks of meals. This made survival less like a gamble and more like arithmetic. Plants were the baseline that steadied the tide of fortune. Storage changed the game further. Roots roasted and dried, seeds ground and packed. Hide containers kept them safe and portable. Suddenly calories lasted the season. It was the earliest form of insurance, turning each successful harvest into an account held for winter. This meant people could plan beyond immediate hunger. They could stay longer in one place, build stronger shelters, and imagine next year instead of only tomorrow. You can see the scale of this shift by the timing. Grinding stones of heavy weight began appearing around the same broad period across many regions. From western plains to far eastern rivers, the need was the same: less game, harsher cold, and hunger pressing bands into new choices. The technology to process plants emerged like fire spreading across dry grass, not in one path, but in many at once. That points to global stress and a shared human answer. The act of pushing a stone across seeds is unremarkable in itself, yet when you look closely, it represents a boundary. It signals humans stepping into more deliberate control of resources, not just picking what the land provided that day, but transforming raw growth into storage, into meals for journeys, into safety for children who would live through lean months. This was more than diet. It reshaped how groups thought about land. A valley filled with edible roots became not just a passing stop. It turned into a seasonal destination, a place logged in memory and told to children. Instead of wandering at random, movement followed routes of guaranteed food, passed down through song and tale. Repetition rooted people to landscapes in ways new to that time. Plant use also touched social ties. Knowledge of safe and dangerous plants, of which ones cured or killed, was currency. Elders who carried that knowledge became anchors of survival. To remember which seeds spoiled or which herbs calmed sickness was to carry lives in the mind. In these memories passed through stories sat the seeds for agriculture, a growing idea that plants could be tended, saved, returned to rather than left behind. Even in small pockets of daily life the change was evident. Children helped gather roots. Women tested plants for toughness and flavour. Men relied on plant meals to steady their strength before the strain of a hunt. Everyone was part of the cycle. The sharing of plant knowledge was collective. It was one of the few skills that belonged not to a single hunter or seamstress, but to the group as a body. Think of the layers: gathering, grinding, cooking, storing, teaching, each step stacked upon the last. Layer by layer, plants gave shape to habits that grew into the first hints of farming. Before furrows were dug, the thought already lived. Food could be shaped by hands as much as by chance. The implications ripple. Once steady calories became dependable, space opened for other pursuits. Art on cave walls, beads sewn into clothing, gatherings with neighbours. None of those are possible if every waking hour is a rush for meat. In that sense, plants did more than feed the body. They bought time, and time made culture. When we try to picture Ice Age survival, it is easy to focus on the spectacle of giant beasts. But the real change, quieter and longer lasting, came from roots, herbs and seeds. They carried calories in secret, hidden under soil or locked behind husks. Humans sorted them, broke them, cooked them, and taught what they learned. This mastery of plants marked the difference between reactive life and proactive planning. Instead of waiting for luck, people carved time and set aside security. Stored food was survival stretched across months. It made bands resilient against sudden drops in game or weather. It prepared them not only to endure the present, but to build toward the future. From here, you can see the arc bending forward. Familiar foods gathered on land were secured now, but people were about to reach farther still, to coasts, where tides lined every shore with another source of abundance. From plant fields of the Ice Age world, the step would be taken into oceans, where mastery of survival extended to the waters that wrapped the continents. Along some ancient coastlines you can still see them, layer after layer of shells piled into ridges stretching across the horizon. To a quick glance they look like trash heaps, the leavings of casual hunting. But the patterns inside those middens tell another story. They show edges worn smooth by years of return, shells stacked in careful order, some sorted by size and species. These piles are not random accidents. They are monuments to a system, evidence that Ice Age bands returned year after year to the same tidal grounds in a rhythm as sure as the moon. Now imagine the inland world at that time. Glaciers pressed forests flat, smothering root systems under ice. Grasslands shrank, and with them the herds that once rolled across plain after plain. Bands who stayed inland often had to chase what was left, following unpredictable prey for miles with no guarantee of success. Against that backdrop, families facing hunger along the shore saw a choice. They could follow diminishing herds farther south, or they could turn toward a frontier that no one had yet claimed fully, the ocean. Unlike the inland hunt, the tide carried its own clock. Twice a day, waves pulled back and revealed fields of shellfish clinging in pools. The food returned with clockwork certainty, no matter the weather. One band could strip a bed bare, and within weeks the tide would renew it. In a frozen world, that predictability was more valuable than any single hunt. Each tide was a harvest that required no chase and less risk. Over time, this built a relationship with the sea as intimate as inland knowledge of reindeer or mammoth migrations. The shells tell us even more. Some layers in middens are thin, filled with small shells, others thick, packed with mature ones. That variation marks careful timing. People weren't just grabbing what they found at random. They understood when to take and when to wait. They harvested at scale, but in ways that allowed beds to recover. The beds acted like living gardens, visited on schedule. It was management, not just collection. The ocean was treated as a provider, a renewable field of its own. Such careful harvesting demanded more than bending down at tide pools. Along these coasts, people crafted tools that survive in fragments. Fish hooks carved from bone show barbs angled so the catch could not slip free. Nets, weighted with shaped stones, hint at cooperative work to pull in fish from deeper channels. Serrated harpoon heads reveal knowledge of different prey, the teeth cut to grip slippery flesh. From Japan to Spain, the designs vary, but the logic is the same. Each shape is tailored to a species, to water depth, to current strength. This is engineering adapted to the movement of the sea. By 20,000 years ago, the evidence suggests people were reaching beyond tide pools. Cod, salmon, and other deep-water fish appear in meals, species that cannot be caught by hand at shore. That means boats, and not just simple rafts that floated near rivers. Fishing rich waters offshore needed craft to carry weight, balance against waves, and return home loaded. It also required navigation, reading wind, cloud, and tide to know when conditions could be faced safely. Every launch meant calculation. Weather watching became survival math. Out on the coast of what is now California, sites give more weight to this picture. Here lies archaeological evidence that people crossed open water to reach islands. These were not short steps along shallow rivers. They were bold crossings where the opposite shore could not always be seen. To make the journey demanded more than curiosity. It required confidence in boats strong enough to hold their course on swell and tide. The finds include bone fish hooks shaped with precision, showing that maritime skills were not only present but refined. Think of what this shift means. A family who once followed herds across open grass now could follow coastlines instead. Along those lines they knew where beds of shellfish lay, where fish gathered, where currents could be trusted. Coastal life created a chain of stops. Bands no longer had to risk starving for weeks inland. They could walk and paddle along the edge of continents, turning the line between land and sea into a reliable highway. That ribbon of coast connected places in ways mountain and tundra never could. The shoreline routes did more than feed. They became carriers of knowledge. Shell ornaments and shared tool designs appear at sites separated by vast distances. These links suggest meeting, trading, and intermarrying across whole coasts. The sea wasn't an obstacle, it was a corridor. Along it spread more than genes. It carried practices, music, and myths. The tide pulled not only shellfish but also human memory, binding distant groups through shared lines of resource and travel. It helps here to think of the ocean as a kind of moving field. Inland soil must wait for seasons, and herds shift unpredictably with grass. At the shore, the tide resets the pantry twice a day. You could almost measure security by the moon itself. That steadiness supported larger groups, longer gatherings, and the luxury of staying put to craft tools or ornaments. Stability meant culture had space to grow. Art, ritual, and social teaching could take root because food supply was no longer all or nothing. But deep water fishing hinted at something larger still. Risk, planning, and mastery over a domain most animals avoided. To venture into those waters was to face a frontier invisible to other species. It required trust in learned skill, shared teamwork, and courage. For groups that succeeded, the ocean was more than provider. It was teacher. It forced navigation, observation, and memory to sharpen. Bands became mariners, and mariners became migrants. Across deep time, this maritime turn reshaped the human map. Populations spread not only through valleys and passes, but along coasts, skipping over frozen interiors that would have been impossible to cross. The vast shoreline of Asia, the jagged edge of Europe, the cliffs of the Americas, all became stepstones for people who carried shell tools and boatcraft with them. Layer by layer, shore life carried humans to places the mammoth hunter could never have reached. What stands out in this story is integration. Clothing allowed survival in cold mammoth bone shelters gave warmth. Fire stretched days long past sundown. Stone tools multiplied work, and reindeer migrations created steady inland food. Add to these the sea's renewable resources, and you see a complete package. Humans shaped an environment where almost every niche was touched: land, steppe, plant, insect, river, and wave. No other creature spread that wide with such speed during such harsh climate. The shells left in long middens are quiet to look at, but they echo with that larger truth. They mark the point where the shoreline became not simply edge, but pathway. For those who walked and paddled there, the world grew wide. Water stopped being barrier, it turned into connection, and that transformation would last, carrying forward into the type of movement and trade that shaped the centuries after the ice withdrew. So when we speak of Ice Age survival, it is tempting to picture only the hunter in furs facing down beast. Yet the shoreline piles remind us of something quieter, yet greater. What saved us was not brute force alone, but the steady rhythm of tide, the clever hook of bone, the courage of a small boat sliding across a channel at dawn. The sea gave a path forward when the land grew barren. It turned survival into navigation. It turned survivors into travellers, and from there, continents opened. 30 skeletons circle a long-dead fire. Their bones lie close together, as if still gathered around its warmth. Some show healed breaks, the kind that would have crippled a hunter for months. Yet these people did not leave each other behind. They lived, healed, and when death came, they were buried side by side. In the middle rests a hearth, its ashes long cold, but still marking the centre where they once shared food, stories, and care. It is a haunting image, one that challenges the picture of hard, lonely survival. The idea of the lone hunter belongs mostly to myth. In reality, deep cold punished those who walked alone. A single injury could end a life far from camp, and one failed hunt could mean starvation. The arithmetic of survival worked differently in bands of 20 to 30. While one person fell short, another succeeded. Meat was divided, hides stitched, children watched. Archaeology shows us that those who pulled risk thrived through generations. At kill sites, bones tell the story of sharing. A mammoth brought down did not feed only those who wielded the weapons. Instead, every scrap of flesh spread outward, distributed by careful rules. Even the marrow-rich bones and fat so vital in the cold were shared out. This was no idealistic gesture. It was a mechanism for survival. If tomorrow's hunt failed, the same hunters who surrendered their portion today would be fed by others. Reciprocity became as essential as the hunt itself. In some sites, the careful arrangement of reindeer remains shows the same logic at work. Carcasses were parted and carried to many hearths, not hoarded in one. That even spread kept children and elders alive when accidents and illness struck hunters down. This wasn't charity. It was insurance, a system built into the rhythm of the camp. It kept the whole band moving forward, not just its strongest members. Burial sites speak just as clearly. The body of an elderly man covered in beads suggests reverence rather than neglect. He likely carried no spear in his last days, but memory made him valuable. Others show hunters whose bones healed after crippling injuries. Someone must have carried them, fed them, protected them until flesh closed and strength returned. That recovery speaks louder than any tale of lone heroes. Weakness did not spell abandonment. Weakness tested the group, and often the group chose to pass. And when we look deeper into the lives of Neanderthals, even they show signs of carrying wounded companions to the end. But in many human sites of the late Ice Age, the evidence stretches further. Old women were buried with tools for grinding seeds, bundles of herbs, even ornaments that required countless hours of collective labour to create. These were not roles dismissed as useless. They were recognised as centres of memory and skill. The dead remind us of the living networks that kept them bound together. Around the hearth, ideas flowed as freely as food. Children learned not only by watching but by hearing. Songs carried roots carved in ice. Stories folded in details of which plants healed. which routes poisoned, where herds crossed valleys. These fictions also transmitted hard data, locked into myths so they could live past a single brain. Long nights required fire, but fire also created classrooms. Wisdom moved from elder to child through rhythm and repetition. Consider leadership. In many systems, power hardens in one place. Yet here, authority was light, passed out based on momentary need. A track in the snow might elevate the sharpest eyes. A lost route might call for the oldest voice with memory of shifting rivers. When hides needed sewing, the deftest hands guided the task. This kind of leadership was fluid, strategy bending to skill. It relied on each member submitting ego for group resilience. Ritual gave the system weight, markings on the skin, feasts where food was consumed in unison, songs sung not alone but in chorus. These created bonds that were not only social but emotional. To feel part of a woven whole meant you might give more readily, share more widely, and stand with others in hardship rather than fall into selfish preservation. These were technologies of feeling, no less vital than tools of stone or bone. The paradox is clear. A species with the capacity for violence and competition survived in climates where both impulses could have led to collapse. What kept them alive was not sharper teeth or quicker speed. It was the invention of cooperation. By banding together, pooling food, rotating authority, caring for the weakest, humanity built collective intelligence. The strength of one became multiplied through many. Disasters ripped through the Ice Age with regular force, storms, temperature swings, sudden loss of prey animals. These broke isolated groups. Yet bands with cohesion endured. They could absorb a failed hunt by spreading risk across families. They could absorb injury, absorbing the loss of one worker by leaning on shared roles. They could absorb grief, knowing that ritual placed their dead within the circle, tying absence back into presence. Where the solitary line failed, the braided rope of bonded lives held firm. We can almost imagine nights when the winds howled louder than fire, and people circled closer, singing to drown fear. In those songs lay data, memory and hope bound with breath. In the laughter of children, stories repeated across decades. In the healed bones of the maimed, days upon days of meals passed selflessly from one mouth to another. Every gesture turned individual risk into group resilience. It was not mythic strength, but ordinary cooperation that shaped survival. This is where our greatest advantage shows. Not in bodies broader than Neanderthals, not in brains larger than other species, but in the act of lowering individual need for group good. By doing so, humans created something greater than biology, a shared intelligence, built not of neurons alone, but of people bound into networks. So when we ask how our ancestors weathered ages of ice, the answer does not rest only in tools or weapons. It rests in the quiet agreements around a shared fire. It rests in food divided, stories passed, voices joined in grief and in joy. These social practices were as vital as needles, shelters, or fire-making. They became foundations for what followed: farming, cities, civilizations, each built on the same simple pattern. We survive not as one, but as many. From here, the story only deepens. Because if social bonds carried us through, we now turn to ask who carried the knowledge inside those bonds. Who remembered the lessons when every scrap of experience could mean life or death? And why did some of the richest burials of the Ice Age belong not to fierce hunters, but to the grandmothers who could no longer chase game at all? In a quiet grave on the edge of the Ice Age, archaeologists found something strange. It was not the body of a young hunter, nor a skilled toolmaker. It was a woman who had lost all her teeth, a grandmother far beyond her years of bearing children. And yet she'd been buried as if she mattered more than anyone. Thousands of ivory beads wrapped her, each one carved by hand. Together they formed a garment so rich in time and labour, it must have cost years of effort. That choice unsettles us because it does not fit the picture of a harsh world, where usefulness ended when strength ran out. Why would a community pour so much into the burial of someone who could no longer hunt or nurse? Evolution often rewards youth and vigour, not old age. Calories given to an elder could have gone toward a child. Energy spent sewing beads could have been used to make hunting gear, and yet here was evidence of the opposite. This apparent paradox is what scientists call the grandmother puzzle. It forces us to ask why a species balanced survival not only on its strongest, but also on its weakest. The grandmother hypothesis suggests an answer. Survivors of long winters, shifting seasons and unpredictable storms did not thrive through bodies alone. They thrived because of memory. Grandmothers, particularly those beyond their years of bearing children, became reservoirs of knowledge. When food sources failed, or when familiar routes shifted under sudden ice, these women carried the memory of what had worked in earlier cycles. Their presence in a band could mean the difference between famine and endurance. Archaeology supports this. Some elderly women were buried with bundles of plants, seed caches, and tools for grinding tough food sources. These graves speak of expertise rather than muscle. One might include herbs for fevers, another roots gathered from ground that only trained eyes could read. The implication is clear. These elders were keepers of plant lore, recipes, and cures. When meat fell short or a sickness spread, their wisdom could keep a community alive. Think of memory like a second kind of granary. A grain store keeps food for winter. An elder holds the map of which plants are safe, which rivers flood, which migrations fail. Those who lived through 3 or more major swings in climate held records no one else had. That archive of experience could be unlocked in moments of crisis. A grandmother's words might save the band more effectively than a sharpened blade. Childcare reveals another part of this puzzle. Studies suggest that children in grandmother-present groups grew stronger and larger. This makes sense. When elders stepped into the role of caregiver, younger adults were freed for the most dangerous work: hunting mammoths, travelling long routes, or scouting predators. The presence of an older woman around the hearth multiplied survival odds in 2 generations at once. The children who grew healthier, and the adults who came back alive from hunts. But the work of grandmothers went beyond food and safety. They were the living libraries in a world without writing. Each long winter became a classroom where elders told stories woven around rhythm and song. To children it may have sounded like fiction, but the lines carried codes. A song might contain the order of rivers to follow, or the season when a certain berry could be dried for storage. A story of a trickster spirit might mask a warning about poisonous roots. The repetition of tales ensured survival information moved forward even when no one could read it on stone. Respect for grandmothers shows in burial clues. Some of the richest graves belonged not to warriors in their prime, but to elderly women. One site reveals an arthritic woman who could no longer walk far, yet she was buried with the same care as the youngest hunter. This was not a people that discarded its weak. It was a culture that placed value where memory gathered and knowledge ripened. To think of the economic side makes the picture sharper. Imagine the hours it takes to learn the life patterns of tubers hidden underground. Some grow only in certain years. Some sprout leaves that mimic poisonous plants. That knowledge cannot be memorized in a season or even a decade. It demands 50 years of lived observation. A grandmother carried in her head skills that no teenager, however strong, could yet master. The decision to feed her in old age was therefore not charity. It was a sound investment. Even the role of conflict resolver or matchmaker hints at the influence of age. In small bands, tension could fracture unity, and fracture endangered survival. Elders often carried enough social weight to smooth arguments and arrange bonds between families. That ability stitched groups together, Without such glue, a band of 20 might split into 2 weak halves, each far less able to face winter storms. So the grandmother offered more than food and childcare. She offered stability that gave groups resilience against their own divisions. There's also evidence that child rearing stretched beyond blood ties. An elderly woman buried with children not her own suggests roles of foster care, where elders shared labour across families. Cooperative raising meant children received consistent knowledge regardless of bloodline. That widened the spread of memory and strengthened the band as a whole. The evolutionary payoff becomes visible here. Bands with grandmothers endured shortages and climate stress with greater adaptability. They supported more children, passed on more knowledge, and recovered faster from shocks. Their survival was not reactive, waiting for disaster to force new strategies. It was proactive, planning layered into stories, plant bundles, and lived memory. In this way, the Ice Age brought forth one of the world's first durable information systems, embodied not in tools of stone, but in the long lives of women. The unsettling grave of the grandmother is not an outlier. It is a clue that the Ice Age did not celebrate only hunters in their prime. It also honoured the keepers of knowledge. These toothless elders were seen as treasures, even when the work of survival seemed harshest. They remind us that strength and speed are not the only engines of endurance. Memory counts too. If grandmothers held the keys to survival, then what about the bonds that joined families together? If wisdom carried us through one storm, what carried our genes into the next? That question leads us from memory to partnership, from the labour of elders to the ties of love and marriage that wove distant bands into single networks of kin. In the dust of an old cave, tiny ivory beads lie scattered across the ground. Each bead has holes drilled so fine they seem delicate enough to break under the slightest pressure. They are not scraps of adornment, but labour carved in thousand-fold repetition. What makes them striking is where they are found. The ivory itself came from far away, over lands no one family could have crossed in a lifetime. These were objects that travelled, carried not as trade in the ordinary sense, but as messages lodged in material form. Step back and ask what danger those beads answered. For any band of Ice Age humans, the circle of known kin was small, perhaps 25 people, maybe 30, stretching across parents, elders, children and siblings. In such small pools, choosing a mate from within risked more than strained relations. It risked shrinking the very future of the group. Inbreeding did not need generations to cripple a line. A few ill-chosen couplings could trap a family into weakness and loss. The genetic knife's edge was sharp, and survival depended upon stepping off it. The puzzle is how people prevented collapse when their world forced each unit to remain scattered, cut off by ice sheets and distances with no beasts of burden to shorten the paths. Archaeology shows hints. The same style of beads carved hundreds of kilometres apart, shell pendants repeated in distant caves, figurines similar in form though their makers never met. One might expect isolated traditions, each group frozen into its own habits. Instead, we see patterns recurring layer by layer for an entire continent. Now the thought grows clearer. These beads were not simple trinkets but signals, passports in material form. They spoke across language gaps. A necklace of a certain style confirmed that its wearer belonged to a group bound by exchange. It suggested eligibility for marriage without suspicion of close kinship. In the cold calculus of small numbers, these signals kept the lineage from folding inward on itself. Seasonal gathering sites tell us how people carried out this weaving of kin. At a site we know today as Dolní Věstonice, the ground bears evidence of massive seasonal assemblies. For a short time, hundreds converged where only a few families had moved singly before. They brought not just hides and tools for trade, but daughters, sons and intentions unspoken yet guided by custom. These events were not only fairs of goods, They were fairs of people, timed against seasons when food was plenty enough to hold a mass of strangers in one place. Families left not just with tools and meat, but with new sons-in-law, new daughters-in-law, new bonds cast outward across distance. The record of bones tells us Homo sapiens succeeded at lifting genetic diversity far above what Neanderthals achieved. DNA studies show Neanderthal populations shrank into pockets, where too much overlap drained their vigour. Humans did something else. They maintained flows of genes across long distances, preventing the choke of narrow inheritance. Each marriage-crossing groups acted as a bridge across potential extinction. What stands out is that romance in these times was not isolated preference, but engineered necessity. Courtship itself became a social technology. Music, the drum of bone on skin, the steady repetition of dance steps under open sky. These were not idle amusements. They were performances where men and women could mark themselves as belonging, available, or pledged. The bonds formed in these ceremonies were thicker than simple affection. They aligned families. They secured hunting rights and safe paths through a neighbour's land. Each union was both affection and diplomacy carried in the same gesture. Think of this system in terms of roads. A single path connects two camps. With time, dozens of such marriages stretch threads outward in many directions. Then knowledge did what goods could not. It rode those lines faster than bodies could travel. New tool forms, new hunting tricks, even remedies from plants crossed from one group to another. Not because strangers met on the plain, but because sons and daughters carried those skills into their marriages. Information moved kinship line to kinship line, spreading wider than any single hunter's range. This created hidden networks far stronger than their apparent size suggested. A small band could face ruin if a storm swept game from their valley. Yet if a daughter had married into a far-off group, ties there became options for refuge. Marriage meant insurance against local collapse. An entire habitat could fail, and yet members could relocate without slipping into stranger roles. Kinship lines provided safe entry. Beads and ornaments carried physical proof of these ties. In one cave, ornaments made from shells arrived from waters hundreds of kilometers away. A burial of a woman's body revealed adornments from regions distinct from the place where she died, clear signs that her life stretched across landscapes rather than remaining fixed. These were tokens with function. They told, silently, that movement between distant peoples had already taken place. The scale of these exchanges is almost geological in its patience. No single life carried the network entire, but layer by layer, over hundreds of lifetimes, the beads and ornaments mapped roots of identity. They stitched scattered bands into what was, in effect, a continent-wide web. Through it flowed not only marriage partners, but packing of trust, faith that a stranger might be less stranger if they bore the signs of connection. That flow is what allowed human survival across shifts that erased Neanderthal enclaves. A lonely island of kinship could falter. A woven set of networks could flex and absorb the blow. Genetics confirm the outcome. Across deep time, modern humans held diversity, keeping their future open. So the beads remind us of the quiet partnership between biology and imagination. Preventing inbreeding was a biological need, but the answer could not come from DNA alone. It came through practice, ornaments, gatherings, and shared ceremonies. Courtship tipped into strategy, where lovers also represented links binding vast webs of kin. Affection became alliance, and alliance became survival. When we see these practices as tools, no less vital than needles or blades, a new picture forms. Love itself carried the weight of strategy. A marriage was not only the joining of two individuals, but the joining of entire networks. That meant knowledge about how to survive a hunt or when to gather roots travelled with them. In effect, romance became the vehicle for information highways. Now we can draw the thread back toward memory. for if marriage forged new ties, someone had to recall them, to keep catalogue of who was allied to who held debts, whose daughter now lived 3 valleys away, whose son hunted by another river. This work lay with the elders, often women who had lived long enough to see generations rise. Their role was not only sewing hides or grinding roots, but holding the maps of kinship in their minds. So these marriage networks lead directly into the next step in our story. The bonds they created made possible a deeper system of record, carried in memory rather than in text. Grandmothers and elders would hold the map of ties, preventing confusion, guiding matches, and ensuring those fragile web lines did not snap. Without them, the beads might still shine, but the meaning would die. With them, the connections lived on, drawn forward into the next generation. The scattered beads on the cave floor are not fragile decorations. They are fragments of one of the most important technologies of the Ice Age. They embody the way humans turned love into strategy, courtship into diplomacy, and ornament into passport. When joined with the memories of the old, they form a survival system that spread strength across space and time. The quiet truth is that Ice Age romance shaped human destiny. It kept bloodlines healthy, but more than that, it fastened distant families into a woven thread strong enough to survive storms, hunts gone wrong, and whole landscapes vanishing. Love carried knowledge as much as seed. It was a social invention that stitched scattered people into humanity. From here, the path bends naturally to those who held the deepest stores of memory. The grandmothers who carried kinship maps in their minds, who remembered not just where the herds moved, but where daughters and sons had gone, and how each tie could be drawn upon in need. Their survival work began where bead and marriage left off. Families spread out across wide valleys. The air is warmer, grass grows thick, and children bend low to gather seeds. Elders tell them about the cold lands their parents once knew, when walls of ice touched the sky. The world seems secure, a slow return to ease after so much hardship. Yet what none of them realise is that these green valleys sit at the edge of another shock. Within decades, the same earth that had opened into spring will close its fist once more. That return to ice has a name we use now, the Younger Dryas. The rhythm of warming after the last glacial maximum had given people hope. For nearly 3,000 years, rivers thawed and grasslands spread. Then, within a single lifetime, the temperature steps backward, not gently, but with a crash. In Greenland, the shift drops the air by 15 degrees Celsius in mere decades. First 5 degrees vanish almost at once, and soon another 10. For those alive, seasons become strange. Flowers bloom one spring and disappear the next. Families who thought they had escaped the cold find winters burying them again. In all of deep time, few moments show such speed of change. The new ice arrives everywhere, but not evenly. River valleys that once fed thousands freeze solid. Grass horizons thin, replaced by tundra mixed with blowing dust. The Clovis people of North America, who once spread with their distinctive tools, vanish from the record layer. These broad, fluted spear points that mark their way of life suddenly stop appearing. To archaeologists, it looks as if a culture has been erased at the line where the cold returns. All at once, the stories told in their stones go quiet. Why did the world stumble like this? Two main ideas still compete. One says that the Great Lake of meltwater in North America, called Lake Agassiz, was the cause. This water, larger than all the Great Lakes combined, pressed against its ice wall until the barrier failed. When it broke, floods raced north, pushing fresh water into the Atlantic. Ocean currents that usually brought warmth stalled. A chain reaction followed, the air snapping cold. Another theory asks us to picture a different trigger, a comet or meteor breaking apart, scattering debris across continents, lifting dust and burning forests in seconds. Both scenarios carry the force to shock climate on a global scale, and neither can be dismissed. While the mystery of cause remains, the toll it took is plain. In the Levant, a culture we call Natufian had begun to shift life around wild cereals. These harvests once promised certainty. But when the younger Dryas struck, the plants failed. Winter reached into sowing season, choking off growth before seed heads could rise. People who had built their rhythm around gathering bent stalks now looked out at empty fields. Hunger pressed from every side. To survive, they carried out an experiment both strange and desperate, placing seeds deliberately back into soil. Some survived by planting when they would once have only gathered. We can read this act today in the dirt of Abu Huraira. Below the cooling line lie layers of diverse wild grains and healthy teeth. Above it, cultivated rye mixes with teeth worn by the grinding of meals. Farming does not come out of choice abundance but from peril. The effect was not limited to plants. The great beasts that had carried generations through lean times met a double threat. Mammoths, mastodons and giant deer already felt climate stress. Now humans with sharpened tools added pressure. With winters tightening and hunters persistent, populations of these animals broke faster than they could replace themselves. The balance tipped, collapsing food systems built around large prey. People watched landscapes thin not just of animals but of the grass and wetlands those animals had maintained. When the last mammoths vanished, the rich steppe shifted into patchy tundra. Each collapse made every other crisis sharper. For small bands, mathematics of survival grew cruel. A failed mammoth hunt no longer meant one less feast, but the absence of bone for shelter, fat for light, skin for warmth. With great animals gone and wild plants unreliable, groups needed new reserves. Some retreated into caves, waiting in hope that conditions would ease. Many did not endure. Others pushed a bold idea: care for plants and secure supply directly. The act of tending a crop began not in plenty but in famine. At first, experiments were crude. Seeds pressed into cold soil often failed. But some plots clung to survival, giving a meagre return. Those returns, though small, meant continuity. Step by step, planting replaced only gathering. Entire families tethered to patches of ground. The start of permanent settlements can be traced here, not to comfort but to necessity. From loss, the idea of control rose. Instead of bowing fully to nature's cycle, people adjusted the cycle with their hands. From this change comes the paradox. At one layer, you see bones cut from widespread hunts. Just above, pottery fragments begin to appear in distant places, used to hold grain or store food. The bow and arrow emerge on many continents. Fire becomes focused not only on warmth, but on food storage. The timing suggests a pattern. The sharper the crisis, the faster minds turn toward invention. Instead of collapse ending the line, the crisis sparks transformation layer by layer. Even migration itself shifted. As grasslands failed, people left with haste. Some went from Central Asia into the Americas, others from Africa northward into Arabia. Coastal groups, already skilled in fishing, pressed along shorelines into new worlds. When inland paths closed, sea routes opened further. The grid of human presence expanded, not shrank. We see not retreat but dispersal across greater distances than ever before. The younger Dryas, though crushing, became a catalyst for spreading the species. Let us return for a moment to the Natufians, those gatherers standing on the brink of change. Imagine a family storing seeds from a harvest too slim to survive the winter. One elder chooses to test an idea, scatter the seeds near camp, then watch. Weeks pass with little gain, then small shoots rise, and later seed heads appear where none had before. It is not abundance, but it is a survival wedge. That choice to act unlocks attention, endure or risk making nature align. Farming is born out of this wager against ice. The irony is deep. For hundreds of thousands of years, survival had meant following rhythms of herd animals, of plant growth, of seasonal migration. But with the younger Dryas, this approach nearly failed. It was the decision to break rhythm, to place hands into the cycle and shape it, that created farming. Villages, surplus, stored food, all trace back to this ice-driven demand for invention. It is not a story of comfort produced by plenty. It is a story of creative desperation producing control. Look again at the record of Clovis. Those long fluted points disappear from soil almost abruptly. Generations had refined them for hunting large game, perfected their edges, shaped their use. Yet when the younger Dryas came, this toolkit could not answer the shift to empty tundra. The tools vanish not because their makers forgot, but because the prey they were built for was gone. Human presence did not disappear altogether, but the culture tied to that weapon system did. In its place rose other ways, smaller points for different prey, traps and bows for more flexible hunts. It shows how deeply technology is chained to climate and ecology. Across deep time, the younger Dryas stands as one of the sharpest lessons in sudden change. Climate does not always move on slow arcs. Sometimes it breaks, jolts in one direction in less time than a life. In those ruptures, species face a narrow gate. Neanderthals once failed to pass through such a gate. Mammoths failed here too. But humans, carrying a tiny balance of memory, curiosity and stubbornness, found ways through. For all its hunger and suffering, this pause of the Ice Age is not humanity's darkest hour. It is a moment of greatest creativity. Across continents, new tools, new homes, new food systems arise. Farming sprouts not from ease, but from pressure. Pottery not for display, but for survival. Even migration itself bends around this shock, carrying humans toward every reachable shore. What looked like collapse becomes acceleration, the start of pathways that will stretch into villages and then cities. The younger Dryas ends, as all ages of climate do. Warming resumes, plants return to valleys and rivers unfreeze, yet humanity has changed. No longer only a follower of seasons, it has begun to guide them. In that shift lies the seed of everything to come. Stored grain, herd animals shifted from wild to tame, permanent dwellings built from stone rather than bone. These all trace to that 1700-year span of cooling. The lesson is stark. We did not endure by resisting change. We endured by altering ourselves into something more than gatherers. This brings us to the lasting implication. The younger Dryas did not halt expansion. It multiplied it. Having survived the worst snap of climate in recorded layers, humans walked into the Holocene prepared not just to survive, but to reshape landscapes entirely. From one band planting rye and frost, a line runs out to the first cities, the first states, and eventually the connected world we now inhabit. The quiet fact is that civilization itself may be the lasting gift of ice returning for one last sting. In the far north, tusks rise from frozen ground in spiral patterns. They look arranged, not scattered. Long arcs of ivory curve in circles, as if the last mammoths gathered there in ritual death. These eerie sights are not random falls of bones. They're graveyards, marked by order, where giants seem to end their line together. For scientists, and for us, these circles whisper of a strange finale to creatures that once roamed from Spain to Alaska. Here sits the paradox. Mammoths and their kin lived through dozens of ice ages. For millions of years, waves of cold and thaw came and went. They endured all of them. And yet, within a mere 10,000 years of a final warming, 4 out of 5 large mammals vanish. This is astonishing speed when we measure it in deep time. Climate had shifted before, but this time something different was at play. The giants failed. Why? One clue lies in the ecosystem they shaped, the mammoth steppe. This was the richest grassland Earth ever carried. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, bison, and horses grazed it, clipped it, and kept it open. Their constant feeding maintained a vast green plain that stretched like an inland ocean across continents. When they were lost, the steppe collapsed. Without grazers to maintain it, grass gave way to patchy tundra and spread of forest scrub. Soil drained of richness. A cascade rolled outward, reshaping entire continents in a span far shorter than the time it had taken to build the steppe. We see a domino effect. Lose the grazers and you lose the grass system. Lose that and entire food webs topple. Carnivores disappear. Birds who fed on insects of the grass plains vanish. With them goes the stability that anchored human survival across those cold lands. Whole systems of life were bound up with mammoth herds. Remove the keystone and it all comes apart. And yet climate alone did not strike them down. People arrived in their world with weapons sharp and plans crafted over fire. Overkill sites show whole groups of mammoths taken with skill. More telling, hunters often targeted calves and breeding females. This strategy was efficient. It also broke replacement chains faster than any natural stress. Populations that could withstand cold or drought could not rebuild when their young were lost each season to human hunting. A single kill meant food. Many kills spread over regions meant collapse. This brings us back to the mammoth bone houses. For centuries people built homes from skulls, ribs, femurs and tusks. Archaeologists uncover circular walls of bone, fitted as neatly as stonework. These villages sang of giants, and then the supply ended. When mammoths died off, not only food sources were lost, entire architectural traditions dissolved. The house itself became impossible when the bricks walked into extinction. Cultural memory tied into tusks vanished with the animal body. The record shifts quickly after. Fishing gear begins to dominate camp floors. Bone harpoons, fish hooks and net weights appear in layer after layer. Plant processing stones pile up, heavy querns used again and again for seeds and roots. Dog remains grow common. With mammoths gone, humans turn to rivers, grains and companionship with animals willing to join their camps. Survival leaned now on many smaller sources rather than one great prey. The feedback loop made this even harsher. Fewer mammoths meant fewer plains trampled open. That meant grass thinned out, which in turn closed habitats for those that remained. Shrinking herds became easier to locate and hunt. Each loss of landscape made the next population more fragile. Climatic stress squeezed them from one side, human planning from the other. Between the two, the giants dwindled to nothing. Now the tragic irony appears. The very tools that gave us survival, longer spears, traps, teamwork, cut down the very animals that had fed those fires and circled those hearths. What we invented to live through cold winds turned back upon our companions in that landscape. We sharpened stone until the edge erased the very balance that first made us possible in those regions. It was not malice, it was survival pressed too far. Lose the megafauna, and you lose not only food but direction. The Ice Age came to its close with silence on the steppes. No trumpeting calls of herds, no great shadows crossing grass. In that silence, people had to choose. They could disappear with the giants, or they could shift once more into a new way of existing. The choice is visible in seeds. Farming begins in the wake of mammoth loss. With no great beast to follow, people looked at Earth and thought of control where once they thought of chance. They planted, they tended, they stored. The great leap forward from mobile hunting bands into farmers and settlers comes as a direct echo from the graves of the giants. The tusks rot, and in their absence grain begins to grow. It would be easy to picture this as triumph, humans rising while beasts fall. But the layers tell a more somber story. These were not easy victories. They were hard shifts forced by gaps in the land. Fishing nets were woven because herds no longer came. Houses shifted to timber or stone because tusks no longer drifted on riverbanks. Farming sprouted not from abundance but from famine. It was desperation that led to lasting change. The extinction of giants shows us the price of adaptation. Humans did not stage some grand victory march. They tested each path, losing traditions as quickly as they built new ones. The end of great animals narrowed choices and pushed experiments into landscapes where failure meant ruin. That many experiments worked is why we are here at all. Think of the spirals of tusks one more time. They feel ceremonial, purposeful, beyond practical explanation. Perhaps the mammoths gathered in herds at their end. Perhaps humans arranged the ivory to mark a passing. Whether accident of nature or act of choice, these spirals mark a close and a beginning side by side. The old order ended with them. The seeds of farming and the roots of cities took shape right where the spirals pressed into earth. From here, the silence of the steppes deepens. The grasses once held down by trampling feet shift into forests. Predators fade from lack of prey. Humans carry forward the memory, but not the companions themselves. The megafauna are gone, not to return. In their absence, our ancestors step into roles they had not held before. Engineer of landscapes, farmer of plants, shaper of futures rather than follower of cycles. So when we say the Ice Age ended, it did not close with triumphal horns. It closed with empty plains where mammoth songs once hung in the air. In that emptiness, necessity pushed survivors toward the agricultural revolution that would shape the next chapter of human life. The world of giants ended, and the world of fields began. The Ice Age was not only cold landscapes and near starvation, it was a turning point that shaped what it means to be human. In refuges squeezed between glaciers, people did more than survive. They invented, cooperated, and built memory systems strong enough to carry across generations. These breakthroughs, fire mastery, sewing needles, shared networks, were not temporary tricks. They are still with us as patterns of thought and organisation. Cooperation, invention, and imagination did not just save us once. They remain the tools we lean on when climate shifts again.